There are moments in life when nothing appears to have changed, when the familiar rhythms of a person's existence continue with such quiet consistency that no one questions them. And yet, beneath that illusion of normalcy, something irreversible has already taken place. Something hidden not by chaos or confusion, but by a careful preservation of routine. And in the quiet suburban outskirts of Columbus, Ohio, that illusion endured just long enough to conceal a truth so unsettling that it would force everyone who encountered it to reconsider what it truly means to be present, to be accounted for, and to be alive. In a neighborhood where houses stood at measured distances from one another, connected by quiet streets and the unspoken understanding that life moved predictably within their walls, Daniel Whitaker lived alone in a modest but meticulously maintained home, a space that reflected his personality in its order, its precision, and its quiet sense of control. Because as a data analyst whose work depended on patterns and consistency, he had built his life around routines that rarely deviated, finding comfort not in spontaneity, but in repetition. Daniel was 41 years old, reserved but courteous, someone who engaged with others when necessary, but preferred the reliability of solitude. And for years, his life had followed a pattern so consistent that it had become almost invisible to those around him, a sequence of actions that unfolded each day with a predictability that felt unbreakable. On the evening of April 4th, Daniel returned home at precisely 6:12 p.m., his car pulling into the driveway as it had countless times before. And as he entered the house, placing his keys in their usual position and setting his bag on the kitchen counter, there was nothing to suggest that this evening would be any different from the ones that had come before it. At 7:03 p.m., he prepared dinner, a simple meal that he ate while reviewing documents on his laptop, occasionally pausing to take notes. And by 8:27 p.m., he had moved into the living room, where he settled into his usual chair, the soft glow of a nearby lamp illuminating the space as he continued working. At 9:41 p.m., he sent an email to a colleague, confirming details for a project due the following week. And when the message was delivered, it marked the last confirmed moment in which Daniel Whitaker was alive. What followed was not immediately apparent, because the sequence of his life appeared to continue. At 7:58 a.m. the next morning, his work account showed activity. At 8:11 a.m., a document was opened. At 8:46 a.m., an email was sent. At 9:22 a.m., another message followed. To anyone observing from the outside, Daniel Whitaker was exactly where he was supposed to be, continuing his work, maintaining his routine, existing within the predictable framework that had defined his life. And yet, Daniel Whitaker was already dead. The realization came slowly, almost reluctantly, as colleagues began to notice subtle inconsistencies in his communication, delays in responses that did not align with his usual efficiency, phrasing that felt slightly altered, as though the person behind the messages understood the structure of his thoughts, but not their nuance. By the second day, when these inconsistencies became impossible to ignore, concern gave way to action, and a welfare check was requested. When officers arrived at Daniel's home, they found the exterior undisturbed, the doors closed, the windows intact, and nothing to suggest that anything had gone wrong. And yet, as they entered, there was an immediate sense that something was not as it should be, not because of what they saw, but because of what they felt, a stillness that seemed too complete, too deliberate. The living room was orderly, the kitchen was clean, his laptop was open on the desk, and in the bedroom, they found him. Daniel Whitaker was lying on the floor beside the bed, his body positioned in a way that suggested a sudden collapse rather than a struggle. And while there were no visible signs of trauma, the autopsy would later confirm that he had been poisoned, the toxin administered in a manner that left little immediate evidence of the act itself. The investigation that followed was defined by a single, unsettling question. How had someone entered the home, committed the crime, and left without leaving behind any trace? And how had they managed to continue Daniel's routine in a way that delayed discovery? The answer began to take shape when investigators examined the digital evidence in detail, identifying subtle anomalies in the timing and structure of the messages sent after Daniel's death, inconsistencies that pointed towards someone attempting to replicate his behavior without fully understanding it. These findings led them to a man named Evan Mercer, a freelance IT consultant who had assisted Daniel with upgrading his home network several weeks earlier. Someone who had been inside the house, had access to his systems, and had observed the routines that defined his daily life. What investigators uncovered about Evan Mercer revealed a pattern of behavior that was both methodical and deeply unsettling, because he had not only retained access to Daniel's systems, but had used that access to monitor his activity, learning his patterns, his habits, and the structure of his routine in a way that allowed him to imitate it with a disturbing level of accuracy. On the night of April 4th, Evan returned to the house. He did not force entry. He used what he already knew. The confrontation that followed was brief, controlled, and devastatingly quiet, leaving behind no immediate signs of struggle. And after it was over, he did something that would transform the case into something far more complex than a simple act of violence. He stayed. Using Daniel's laptop and phone, he sent emails, opened documents, and maintained the illusion that Daniel Whitaker was still alive, extending the timeline of his presence and delaying the moment when anyone would realize what had happened. He continued the pattern. He became the routine. Evan Mercer was eventually identified, arrested, and convicted. His confession revealing a mindset defined not by impulse, but by control, describing his actions as a process of observation, imitation, and execution, as though the crime itself had been the final step in a sequence that had begun long before that night. But the resolution of the case did not erase the unease it created, because what happened in that house did not rely on force or chaos, but on familiarity, access, and the assumption that routine equates to safety. And even now, in homes where daily patterns unfold with quiet consistency and digital activity creates the illusion of presence, there remains a possibility that lingers just beneath the surface of ordinary life. That sometimes the routine you trust the most is the one someone else is already following.